Hello, my name is Christopher Jordan, and today I will be discussing the French Republic, which is my case study for Introduction to Comparative Politics. And just as a quick outline of what we will be discussing, we'll be talking about France's governmental history. We will be looking at an overview of France's current government. We'll look at French economic standing and the standard of living of its citizens. We'll talk about its population and its ethnic and religious makeup. We'll talk about France's outside relations, especially with the United States, China, and the rest of Europe. And given the fact that we are taking comparative politics, we'll be comparing France's method of governance with that of Germany and the United States, and we'll see how and why they developed somewhat differently. Before we can talk about any of those things, we of course have to talk about France's development into the democracy that we know today. And as many of you may know, for over 1,000 years, France was ruled by an autocratic monarchy. This monarchy was absolutist. It had nearly complete control over France's domestic and foreign affairs. It's also important to realize that this monarchy developed in the power vacuum that arose in the wake of the fall of the Roman Empire. It's very interesting because this autocracy maintained itself via a unique alliance between, of course, the king, but also the aristocracy and the clergy. The aristocracy owned all of the lands in France and controlled nearly all of its material wealth. The clergy served the role of legitimizing the French king and his claims to divine right, which asserts that his right to rule is derived from God. And the height of the French crown's power is undisputedly held by Louis XIV, who is pictured to your right. He was known as the Sun King by his contemporaries, and he is famous for saying, "L'État c'est moi," meaning the state, I am the state. The political regime of the time revolved around a personality cult, specifically around the king. He could do no wrong. His word was not only law, but it was divinely inspired. So now we get to talk about the five republics and the events that took place after the French Revolution. And it's important to realize that the 19th and 20th centuries were extremely turbulent. They were marked by regular and violent regime change. It was a very rare thing for a government to last more than 20 years during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And unlike many other countries, French democracy evolved over the course of 5 republics. Each republic had its own constitution and took place over its own time period. What's more, these republics were not consecutive. They were broken up by several periods of empire, of monarchy, and by occupation. They were separated by 2 empirical periods, the First and Second Empire, the Bourbon Restoration, which was a time period in which the House of Bourbon, which had controlled France for over 1,000 years, had reasserted its control over France for a period of time, as well as the German invasion. And upon their arrival, they established what is known as l'État français, which was more or less a Nazi puppet regime and a German satellite state. Today, France finds itself in the Fifth Republic, which was established by the Constitution of 1958. It was founded more or less by Charles de Gaulle, who was a famous war hero. He was instrumental in the liberation of Paris from the Germans in 1944. and played a fundamental role in managing the French resistance, which took as its aim to combat fascism in Europe during World War II. The political regime is dominated by the expression liberté, égalité, et fraternité. In English, that is freedom, equality, and brotherhood. These are as quintessentially French as anything else. And it's also important to understand that the reason the Fifth Republic was adopted and the Fourth Republic was disposed of is that France needed a much more powerful presidency, and the people felt that France's former parliamentary method of governance was not compatible with France's needs. And so now let's talk about the makeup of this government, the French government. We'll first talk about the executive. France's president is currently François Hollande, who was elected 2 or 3 years ago, and the executive is also shared with Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who was very recently elected in the wake of France's municipal elections only a month or two ago. And the presidency is more or less an enigma in Europe. It is very powerful, and this is extremely strange for Europe. Among his or her powers are the power to ratify treaties. He appoints the prime minister when his or her party controls the Assemblée Nationale, which is a chamber of the French Parliament. He or she also appoints 3 seats to the Constitutional Council, which we will be discussing later, and is commander-in-chief of the French military. Now we'll talk about the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister's authority is much less clear. The Constitution of 1958 doesn't really spell out exactly what their powers are. But they are chosen by the president when, again, the president's party also controls the parliament. But this approval process by the parliament becomes far more important when the party control of parliament and the presidency differs. When the president and the prime minister are not from the same party, this is known as cohabitation. And what this means is that the president and the prime minister must begin to share executive power. Now we'll begin to talk about the legislature, and we'll start with l'Assemblée Nationale. And France's legislature is bicameral, and the l'Assemblée Nationale, or the National Assembly, is clearly more powerful than the Senate, or le Sénat. The National Assembly elects the Prime Minister, although this is more a formality when the President's party also happens to control the Parliament. The National Assembly must approve all bills, which are known in French as projets de loi, and these are proposed almost exclusively by the government or the executive authority. Now we'll talk about a little about the Senate, which is significantly less powerful. The Senate lacks popular legitimacy mainly because it is appointed by regional officials rather than being directly elected. And because of this, the Senate can only delay proposed laws. They don't actually have any authority to prevent bills from being enacted. All they can really do is obstruct. And as I said before, members are indirectly chosen. Their only formal power within the French system of government is to block constitutional amendments. So constitutional amendments not only have to receive approval from the National Assembly, they must also receive approval from the Senate. Now we'll talk about France's version of judicial review, and it doesn't take the same form as that which we're familiar with in the United States. And it has what I like to refer to as preemptive constitutional review. And this preemptive constitutional review is vested in le Conseil constitutionnel, or the Constitutional Council. And they, upon solicitation by a member of either the Senate or the National Assembly, can invalidate a bill before it is enacted. So unlike the United States, in which the process of invalidating a law for constitutional reasons is retroactive, in France, this is actually a part of the legislative process. And one of the powers of the president is to appoint 3 seats to this council, and the other seats are chosen by other bodies of government. So now we'll talk a little about political economy, and we'll talk about prosperity. France's GDP is among the highest in the world at approximately $2 trillion. This is in comparison to the United States' 2012 GDP of approximately $14 trillion. In spite of this high number, France has currently been suffering a double-dip recession for many reasons, but mainly because of the Eurozone crisis and the economic insolvency in Portugal, Spain, but especially Greece. And its post-war prosperity can be said to have lended to its relative stability. When people know less hardship, they're more likely to be more content with their governmental state of affairs. It's also important to realize that after World War II, France's economy has undergone extensive privatization. The French government has sold off more and more sectors of the economy to private groups. However, the French government still plays a major role in the French economy. There are still several sectors that it dominates, most importantly the defense industry. So now let's talk a little bit about demographics. France has a very interesting religious makeup. France is, of course, dominated by Roman Catholicism. Some 80 to 83% of the French population claims Roman Catholicism as their religion. But increasingly, France has had an insurgence of Muslim and unaffiliated populations, and this is very interesting. It has one of the highest one of the largest populations of Muslims in the Western world. And what's more, the French people are becoming increasingly unaffiliated, meaning that they either have no religious denomination or are adopting atheism, secularism, etc. It's also important to understand that government secularism is overwhelmingly prioritized by the French Republic. So, in essence, what this means is that the French government does not interfere in matters of theology and takes no official religion. And here we have a nice graphic display of the religious affiliation distribution, courtesy of the CIA World Factbook. And we also need to talk about its ethnicity. Most of France's population still identifies as white. This is the same throughout most of Europe, especially the Anglo-Saxon and Germanic populations. However, there is a significant black population in France, especially in the wake of colonialism and decolonization in the late 20th century. What's more, France is seeing a large influx of immigrants who are coming into the country because of strife and economic and political turmoil throughout the world. And we of course need to talk about France's foreign relations and how it gets along with all the other kids in the classroom. So it's important to understand that France is one of the founding members of the European Union and is currently among the most powerful members of this organization, along with Germany. Together, the countries in the European Union work to provide for a united front to the outside world, and they also work together to guarantee economic solvency within Europe. The members of the European Union, which numbers some 23, all share the same currency, or not all of them, but most of them do share the same currency, which is called the euro, and this is said to provide for some economic stability in Europe. All of that I just explained. So how does France get along with countries outside of Europe? Well, France has very warm relations with the United States and Canada. In spite of the debacle that was the U.S. invasion of Iraq, U.S.-French relations have healed significantly during the time period in which the invasion of Syria became more and more likely. France was the only country other than the United States that was willing to engage in military intervention in Syria. And this is pretty important. Along with the rest of Europe, France is attempting to isolate Russia because of its aggression in Ukraine. Now, not only is Europe dependent on Russian natural gas and other fossil fuels, but Russia's economy is very much reliant upon these industries as sources of revenue. Therefore, Europe, especially France, is looking for methods by which they can get these fuels from elsewhere in order to cut off Vladimir Putin's supply line of capital. And like a lot of Europe, France tries to court Chinese investment, given that country's burgeoning middle class and its seemingly unstoppable economic growth. It's also very important to realize that France maintains significant influence in its former colonial holdings. When these regions experience crises in nutrition or in governmental instability, France is typically the country to intervene, and most of these are in Africa. Most recently, France has intervened in Libya to help depose Muammar al-Gaddafi, even though that territory was controlled by Italy. But also, France intervened militarily in Côte d'Ivoire in order to depose Laurent Gbagbo, who decided to stay in office even after losing an election. Also, France invaded Mali in order to repel an Islamic terrorist insurgency in that country, which was more or less successful. So how does France stack up with other countries? Specifically, how does its method of governance compare? Well, let's take a look at Germany. Now, Germany, unlike France, is a federation. They emphasize local government, and local governments in Germany have quite a bit of discretion and power. By contrast, France is a unitary system. It is dominated by one government, more or less, although there are local governments to handle regional disputes and to meet regional needs. France, unlike Germany, has a very strong presidency that has a lot of sway over French politics. By contrast, most German executive power is vested in the Chancellor Angela Merkel. Now let's talk about the United States. Like Germany, the United States has a federal system composed of states, and these states have a significant amount of power in determining their own destiny. But where the similarities really lie between the United States and France are in its economic stagnation, which has led to a resurgence in political conservatism. Just recently, the conservative parties have seen an uptick in popularity during France's municipal elections, and that largely stems from the fact that France finds itself in a double-dip recession. But it's also important to realize that France and the United States are struck by very similar dynamics. Urban versus rural values, modernism versus postmodernism, and religion versus secularism. How much influence should religion have over politics and over public life? And you also have to consider the fact that both countries are experimenting with populism, socialism, and free enterprise. How much of the economy should be controlled by private interests, and how much of it should be controlled by the government? Both France and the United States face very similar questions. And we've gone over all of this over the course of this class. And with that, I thank you for watching my presentation, and I bid you adieu. Please leave a comment, and I hope you all have a wonderful summer. Thank you.